Martin Green is a pioneering DJ, curator, and cultural archivist, best known as the founder of Smashing, the legendary 1990s Soho club that became a cornerstone of the Britpop era nightlife. He toured with Pulp and has DJed for Blur, Suede, Paul McCartney, the Rolling Stones, and fashion houses like Chanel and Prada. He's a passionate collector. He compiled the Sound Gallery and over 30 albums of lounge soundtracks and musical curiosities. In 2010, Green co-founded Duovision Arts with James Lawler to spotlight overlooked artists, especially from the LGBTQ community. Duovision has exhibited work by Duggie Fields, Marc Almond, Pam Hogg, Jarvis Cocker, and others. In 2023, their Outlaws show at the Fashion and Textile Museum highlighted 1980s alternative designers linked to Leigh Bowery's Taboo Club. Their latest exhibition at the Museum of Liverpool celebrates Holly Johnson's cultural legacy. Green's work bridges club culture, visual art, and archival storytelling, championing the creative and the unconventional with style and substance. So Martin Green, welcome. Well, we're going to be talking about lots of things today, I hope. I want to get to the idea of art and music and the combination and your exhibitions a little bit later. But I want to talk about you at first and your childhood and your initial connection to music through your parents.
Okay, well, thank you for asking me on the show. I had kind of a sort of interesting childhood regarding music. So I grew up in East London, Essex, and my parents were very into. My mother was, I think, 24 when I was born, which in the 60s was quite old, and my father was 40, which was very old at that time, and my mother liked rock and roll and those kind of, and also jazz. My father liked film music, which was a very big influence on me. So my father had a lot of film soundtracks, and then my mother had some jazz and some, as I said, rock and roll, and so I had a kind of quite a varied musical experience in the house. We'd have the gramophone with the radiogram, and we'd get the records out, and so that's what we'd be listening to. But I also had an aunt who was 7 years younger than my mother, and at those, and of course, in those times, that was a big age difference. So my aunt, so my mum was a kind of had been as a kid, was into skiffle and rock and roll and all those kind of the trad jazz. My aunt was a hippie. So my aunt had Beatles, Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, Colin Blunstone, Moody Blues, Labi Siffredi, all those kind of things. So I used to borrow her records. When I got my own little record player, I was obsessed with records from a little kid, and pop music. And I used to borrow my aunt's records and listen to her records. So I had this kind of mix of kind of alternative 60s hippie kind of rock psychedelia, and then jazz from my mother, and film soundtracks. So I had a very kind of odd mix. So when I was at school, I felt very much like an outsider because everyone was into the Bay City Rollers, and I was into the Beatles, and no one had heard of the Beatles by sort of mid-70s. All the kids had forgotten about them. So I was listening to all these kind of things, and so I always had a bit of an alternative musical upbringing, really.
Was music an escape for you, though?
Yeah, well, I had a kind of, my parents went through divorce, and so yeah, it was very much an escape, and but it was something I was very, very passionate about, and I still am. And it's always been, I've always looked at music that isn't on as a kid really, that's not the mainstream. Yeah, so I suppose it is an escape, and it's also I've kind of been a bit of an archivist even from being a kid really.
Was there an artist when you were a teenager who was sort of the most impactful, where you had the feeling maybe of belonging or providing a world of discovery?
David Bowie, of course. So David Bowie, I borrowed, my aunt had Ziggy Stardust, and so I used to go to my aunt's and I used to buy some records, and I put Ziggy Stardust on, and I was about 11, I suppose. So this was 78. So Bowie had kind of retreated a bit, really. I'd heard that, I recognised the name. He wasn't on top of the pops anymore. It was all kind of low heroes period. He wasn't living in the UK, and I put on Ziggy Stardust and thought, "Oh, this is crazy! This record. What is this record?" But then I couldn't stop listening to it, and really fell in love with it. And so then I remember going to school. I think it was about 11, 12. It was about 78-ish. Anyway, so I went to school. I'd just gone into senior school. Went to school and said, "Oh, I've discovered that this David Bowie is amazing." And then I had some kids saying, "He's a poof, he's a poof," and all of that. So, but what do you like him for? He's a poof, and all that kind of stuff. So but I sort of stuck to my guns, really. I just thought, I don't really care. I like him. And then I started getting more and more interested in David Bowie, and then David Bowie took me into Roxy music and all of those kind of things.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned David Bowie, and then you mentioned Roxy music, Brian Ferry, of course. So both of them went to art college. Both of them
It was
very
all very
heavily
art
influenced.
school, yeah. And my aunt was very into art, and my parents were to a fair degree, but my aunt very much was. So it was a kind of artsy, it was quite an artsy kind of upbringing, but it wasn't mega bohemian because we were at the suburbs, So, but David Bowie very much was someone who no one liked at school at all. This was the time of sort of new wave. Everyone was craving about Blondie and then Two Tone. So to like David Bowie and those kind of glam things was, you were kind of quite demonized. And then New Romantics happened, so it kind of connected. The David Bowie and the New Romantic thing kind of connected.
But you yourself, you didn't go to art college?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Okay, where did you go?
Yeah, so I went to art college when I was 16 to East Ham Polytechnic, and I did a foundation course there. And but when I was at school, because it was, it was quite a conservative place, really. You just kind of, and because my heroes all went to art school, I just wanted to get out and go to art school. So from when I was about 12, I've got to get to art school, got to go to art school. And then I went to art school, and then suddenly you meet people. I was 16, went to art school, and then met people who'd heard of the Velvet Underground, who'd heard of Roxy and all those things, all those people. And so you just suddenly meet like-minded people. And some of those people had careers in arts, and some of them went into other things.
What do you think art college or art school gives students that impacts so heavily on music? What is the thinking at art school that is different?
I don't think it's like that now, but I think at the time, art school, because remember, it was a time you could get grants, so anybody from any background could go and get an education. And art schools were just a place for the funny old misfits, really, like myself, that didn't really feel they fitted in with anything, but had an interest in creativity. And you could just go, and they'd pay you to go to college and be around a load of other misfits. And and some of those misfits, music was, I don't think people can understand now, younger people can kind of understand how important music was. I mean, you would be chased down the street for liking a band. If you had a band on, if you had I remember a kid at school used to come in with Ultravox written on his bag, you know, and he was a couple of years above, and people used to chase him down the throw things at him, all that kind of stuff. You know, if you liked anything alternative, you really did, you know, kind of take your life in your hands almost. You know, it was kind of it was alternative. Really was alternative.
The sort of things that have always made the great artists, so the ability to sort of experiment, the way that they could have some form of personal expression, the way they pushed boundaries or questioned the norms, and they had a unique perspective. And for me, that is always something that, although, you know, you said you were with a load of misfits, I feel art school is that in a way.
Well, it was that. It's not like that now, but it's, I mean, because people go to art school because you have to pay, you know, tens of thousands to go to college. People go because they want to study that subject, where people went because they didn't really have anywhere else to go, which is why you had people from the fifth. I mean, the Beatles, you know, John Lennon went to art school, didn't he? And so we're right the way back. People would go there, and then sort of rebellious people, and then some would go into fine art, some would go into design, some would go into fashion, some would go into music, all sorts of different areas people would go into. But it was very much for sort of like-minded people, where now it's for people that want a career on that particular subject.
How did you become a DJ?
I've always bought records. I've always been obsessed with records and music. And then I just used to get asked to play at people's parties, you know, in halls of residence and things like that. And then I kind of, that was it really. And I loved doing it. And so I just met a group of people. So at the time, so as I started, there's now quite a key album which I bought on the way home from school was film sound. I went to a charity shop and there was a soundtrack in there, and it was Barbarella film soundtrack, and it was 50p, but it wasn't the actual soundtrack. It was a cover versions of Barbarella, like a low budget thing for by the Young Lovers, and it had this girl on the cover with a spacesuit on, and you know, and a laser gun, you know, and I bought it, and I really liked it, and I think I'd just seen the film on the telly, so I was about 15, and so that kind of, and I was interested in film soundtracks, and then I kind of got interested in these kind of alternative cover versions of things, and easy listening and lounge music, as well as contemporary music was going on. So when I'd go out, I'd buy The Associates and I'd buy Human League, but then I'd also buy things like Quincy Jones film soundtracks and odd things like that, really. So I was kind of interested in a lot of this sort of 60s music, and I like the sort of style. And but there was I didn't know anybody into that kind of thing at all. And then in 1988, just as rave took off, I went to, because I've been going to clubs a bit. I went to Taboo and the Mud Club and those sort of places. And then I went to Shoom, which I quite liked, but I wasn't particularly into it. But right at the same time, I went to a little club called Violets, which was in Soho, in Walker's Court. And a friend said, mentioned it, said, "Oh, there's this little club happening. It was called The Happening, and it sounds like the sort of thing you'd like." So I went down there, and it was this 1950s old hostess club. And so as rave was taking off, and everyone was taking ease and wearing t-shirts and going crazy, jumping around to kind of rave music, house music, there was this little club in a basement playing but Bacharach, and 60s soundtracks, and everyone was dressed up in kind of 60s clothes. I remember Boys Wonder being there. It was Jarvis Cocker's first club that he went to when he came to London, and it was run by a group of kind of beatniky characters that then formed the band called the Sandals. And a lot of those acid jazz. Paul Daly from Left Field used to play congas down there. They did poetry readings, body painting, and it was a tiny little scene. And I just thought, this is my scene straight away, and started hanging out there, got to know them, and then together we ran a club in 1990, a place called the Gardening Club in Covent Garden, which is now the basement of the Apple store. Which is like was a cellar place, and we ran a club there called Tung Kung Fu, and I DJed. So that was my first sort of weekly DJing, playing film soundtracks, all these kind of odd things. So they were a kind of gang of people that were all into the same kind of thing. And through that crowd, people like Jamiroquai and Brand New Heavies, the whole acid jazz thing was all around that scene. So yeah, it was exciting on a Thursday night, and people like Pulp and those sort of people used to come down there as well.
I mean, what's interesting is with your sort of career and really from your background is that it has led to curating exhibitions, and it has led sort of through the people you know and you've met to get to that point. How did you become a curator?
Well, that happened. I've always been interested in art, and I've always gone to lots of exhibitions. And I met a guy called James Lawler about 15 years ago, and we became friends. And he was a curator in Liverpool, based in Liverpool, and he'd been curating exhibitions for quite a few years. And he was saying about how, it's quite hard going, but I'd never even thought about curating exhibitions. And together we went to see an exhibition about postmodernism at the V&A. And one of the most important British postmodernism artists, I feel, is Duggie Fields, because he encapsulated that kind of late 70s into 80s postmodernism movement, Memphis and everything. It was he embodied it completely. And he wasn't in the exhibition. And I was really furious about that. And so was James, because James is a fan of Duggie as well. And I've met Duggie a few times through Andrew Logan, who organised the Alternative Miss World, and he's a good friend. So I got in touch with Andrew and said, "Can you put me in touch with Duggie?" Which he did. Went round. So I said, because James was working out of a gallery in Liverpool, and I said we should do a exhibition of Duggie's work, So we went to a Duggie. Duggie said he hadn't had an exhibition for nearly 25 years, and he said yes. He said he'd like to do it. So we did his first exhibition in a long, long time up in Liverpool. It got a great response. It was our first time of working together. And the process of it, I loved putting the show together. I loved putting the exhibition together, working with Duggie, working with James. But also something clicked. And it was kind of like what I've done with curating records and curating music for a dance floor, is where that's been about finding the B-sides and the obscure artists and forgotten artists. And it's the same with art. So I thought there must be some other artists out there that just deserve recognition, that haven't got the recognition, that have just kind of fallen through the cracks because of fashion and that the work's not particularly commercial. So we started to look into different artists who we felt had been neglected, a lot of older artists. And that's what we did. And we started working on exhibitions. Then we ended up running a gallery. The gallery started running it up in Liverpool ourselves, and which until lockdown, when we lost the place to developers. So that's how it happened. So I've curated over 40 exhibitions, and it's always been about looking at those kind of forgotten people. In a way, I've done that with music, looking at forgotten musicians and artists as well, because I think it's important, because otherwise they do end up disappearing and their archives can disappear.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fascinating because that is the case that, that sometimes it's really important to make sure that those sort of people aren't forgotten. But you've also been involved with people who have a bigger name, but not always known primarily for their art, but for their music, which contains art. I mean, if you look
Yeah.
at, there was a picture on Instagram, I think yesterday you had breakfast with Marc Almond and Mark Moore.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
couldn't help noticing that. And of
Yeah, that was
course,
fun. Yeah.
with Marc Almond went to Leeds Polytechnic, didn't he? He studied
Yeah.
art there. And in his music and performance from the beginning, from Soft Cell on, and in his performance on stage, he's obviously influenced by the avant-garde, he's influenced by experimental theatre and by, well, Weimar Republic art, I would say, cabaret, expressionism, stuff like
Yes.
that.
Yeah, very much performance. Yes.
So what did you do with him, and what do you think you brought to the fore of what he's done?
Well, we did. Because I've just always looked to the intersection. Well, Duggie Fields did music. I mean, he was that painter. He also did video work. He did some music. So a lot of the artists we've worked with, like Caroline Coon, she was a painter that then became a music journalist, and then managed the Clash, and then went back into painting. And so, we've worked with. There's all this. They kind of mesh together, really, and I wanted to do an exhibition when we had the gallery in Liverpool about Marc Almond. I thought it'd be good to has him as a muse because he's been photographed and painted by lots of different artists and creatives. So I got in touch with Marc and to see what to talk about what we could put in there, because there's those famous Pierre and Gilles pictures painted by Matthew Stradlin and Mark Wardell, and then great photographs by Peter Ashworth, and lots and lots of different, really great. And Mark has such an iconic look, incredible. So, and when we had a meeting about it, he said, "Oh, I've got some collages that I do. I do these collages as sort of mood boards for my albums, and would you like to see them?" So he said he had like a folder of them, and they'd never been exhibited or anything. So we looked at them and loved them. So he framed them up, put them in the exhibition as well, and people really responded well to them. We did some prints from them, and then we did an exhibition called Creative Rage and included them in that exhibition. And then we did an exhibition in the Farsight Gallery, which is run by Sean McCluskey in just off Denmark Street. We did a Marc Almond exhibition there recently, last year, and put the collages in, and they're absolutely they're terrific collages, and they're very him, and but it's just him just creating his own work just comes naturally because he's come through art school and and has that background.
So he uses these collages that he finds pictures, put them together as collages, and he uses those to inspire him in terms of his music. This is the basis of how he creates.
Yeah, some of it, or some art for ideas for album covers or mood boards. It's a mood board kind of thing, but they're beautiful. And so then he started doing them in their own right as well. So they've got quite a kind of Kenneth Halliwell kind of feel to them. Some of them, they're quite dark. They're great, but they just reflect him as well as ideas.
I think the beauty of what Marc Almond does, it's not only the visual, but also the lyrical, because it's
Yeah.
sort of like his lyrics are like some form of miniature dramas.
So he's another one of those ones which you don't really get many artists that are that have got a kind of generosity in the way that Mark has. So someone like Bowie had, in terms of, you'd get into David Bowie and then David Bowie would take you on a journey. So through David Bowie, you'd learn about um, uh, Brecht, or you'd learn about I remember seeing a little feature on him in the Enemy or Sounds or something like that. David Bowie's just bought a Kraftwerk album, and he's bought a Talking Heads album. So of course you go out and buy Talking Heads and Kraftwerk. So you kind of, and Mark's very much the same. So I remember hearing Mark Almond and him covering Scott Walker, Jacques Brel, and so you can go into all these kind of different paths through them. They inspire you into other artists, and so it's not just Mark; it's the whole world and the whole inspiration, and they share it with you, which is very generous.
Now, don't go away. There's more of Martin Green coming up, but just time for me to ask you to please subscribe to this podcast. And if you want to check out all the interviews, go to popthehistorymakers.com. I mean, he was also, or he is also, a pioneer in queer identity, isn't he? You know, this sort of camp and glamour. Who do you feel he influenced?
Well, it's difficult to say really, because I remember when I first saw him on Top of the Pops in Tainted Love, and then I went and saw him perform live around that time of Mark and the Mambs and everything. You'd never seen anything like it in your front room. When Mark appeared, all in black with those bangles, everything like that, with Dave in a suit on a Dave Ball playing the synth. I mean, you'd never seen anything like it. And we kind of grew up with a lot of that experience. So you'd never seen anything like it. Then within a couple of years, you saw Boy George on the TV. When you saw Phil Oakey with that fringe, you were constantly seeing these characters, and you were like, where on earth is that coming from? That is just genius. And I think Mark was, because he had a kind of campy, gothy, it was very gothy as well. I think it kind of inspired all those kind of Batcave people and all that kind of the kind of gender blurring goth movement, that early 80s, which was kind of covered in makeup and you really couldn't work out if anyone was gay or straight or male or female or anything really. It was very much blurring all of that, but in a kind of, but in quite a dark way, not in a kind of new romantic way, much more of a kind of goth way. So yeah, I think it was incredibly influential, and then the sound was incredibly influential as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was extremely visually provocative, and like you mentioned, there was sort of a number of artists, particularly of that era. And another exhibition that you've done is of Holly Johnson from Frankie Goes to Hollywood.
Yes.
And they were so musically exciting, and yet they were unbelievably provocative and theatrical at the same time. Well, he was particularly.
Yeah, well, the band were. I mean, the exhibition, and that's currently on at the moment in the Liverpool Museum. There's Holly Johnson's story. So it's about Holly before Frankie, when he was big in Japan, and he had a little solo career, and then Frankie, and then into his own solo career, and then his artwork as well, because he paints. He's a fantastic painter, and he has, and we've exhibited a lot of his paintings there, and then his clothes as well. Because what's brilliant about Holly, he's kept everything. So he's got an amazing archive of posters, ephemera, clothing, and then his artwork. So we've put all that together to tell the story. And then, banning the record, and then the unbelievable hostility he got from the press when he was outed as having HIV, and all of those kind of things. So he's... he's had, like Mark, they kind of had heroic careers, when there wasn't a kind of a mass the support for those people were from fans. It wasn't from the tabloids or any of that kind of stuff. They were all, all out to hound them, but the fans were incredibly loyal, and so we wanted to show with that exhibition that incredible story that Holly's had.
I mean, it was a really, I mean, we're talking about the 80s, which was an era that, being queer myself and living through that era, was in many ways horrendous and very difficult to, I think it's very difficult to understand for younger gay people today about what that era really was. And I think, in a sense, do you think that by curating these exhibitions, you're sort of also being able to bring something new to young people to understand a different era and how it was being queer in a different era?
Yeah, we hope to. But I mean, what we've always done with our exhibitions is we've always, although we prioritize LGBT people, what we prioritize is talent and creativity and originality, and brilliance over the top of it all. So that's what we do. And people like Holly and Duggie Fields and Andrew Logan and Marc Almond. I mean, they are what they do is brilliant, and it's inspiring, and they've all been highly original, and they've just carved these paths out for themselves. To some successfully, some not so successfully, and they're the people that we really champion, because I want to appeal to a very broad audience, and so we get a lot of straight people come to the exhibitions, a lot of queer people, all kinds of people come to the exhibitions, younger people and older people, and especially with someone like Holly, those at the museums. That's a great venue because it's at the Liverpool Museum. You're getting loads of kids coming along because they might not really know anything about Holly Johnson, but they know all the records. And because of the way Spotify and playlists work, they know all of these records and Marc Almond's. They know them all. So but they don't know the background history of them all and who these characters are. So we are letting them know a lot about those people, and I think it's important. I think they've got very important stories to tell.
Why do you think we are at an era where people like Leigh Bowery and the outcasts that you mentioned before, people like Leigh Bowery have become such important figures, and many of them not necessarily at the period where they were doing their art were as successful then. Leigh Bowery, it's what is it, 30 years after his death, and he's suddenly the focus of one of your exhibitions and the Tate exhibition.
I think with them all, it was a weird, it was an odd period really, because what you had a kind of, you had a central media. So you had this, so you didn't have social media, YouTube, any of that stuff. So you had this kind of lump in the middle of I always think it's like a moat. So you've got a moat of creativity and oddities and all that, and in the middle there's this kind of fortress, and that fortress was BBC, and then a bit later Channel 4 and ITV. But I mean, ITV didn't really count so much, but BBC and Channel 4 did have opportunities like programs like Riverside, Oxford Roadshow, The Tube, and they'd look around, and the Top of the Pops, of course, and then these kind of characters that were around the margins of popular culture could find little avenues in to the mainstream. So you'd have Marc Almond on top of the pops, you'd have Boy George on top of the pops. Before that, you'd have David Bowie on top of the pops because someone cancelled and wouldn't go on. They got David Bowie on, and there's lots of stories like that. Someone cancelled and Sparks got on top of the pops, and so there was all the way through history. So there was a ways of these characters that were very really left field getting into the mainstream and getting to appeal to enormous audience numbers. So, and there's unfortunately now, although we've got things like YouTube and podcasts and everything, which are great, you haven't got that arts programming that we used to have a lot of. So, and that carried right the way up into the 90s with people like programs like The Word, where you'd have bands like Stereo Lab on their L7, Pulp, and Elastica, and all these kind of people had all these ways of kind of getting into the mainstream, and sadly that doesn't exist so much, you know. So I think that's incredibly important, and I think that's the way everything kind of progressed culturally.
So what value do you think pop music has today, taking that into account?
I think there was a survey a little while ago where music is actually more popular than ever before, but it's less important. So where when we grew up, I mean, I remember kids at school weren't remotely into music. You know, there was a handful of us that were into music, and then and a smaller number into the kind of more alternative music. But you were really, really into it because you had to pay, you had to save your pennies up to go and buy a record. You couldn't just listen to it on your phone. So these things meant something to you. And so now I think music is just become like a kind of, it's just much more about entertainment than a kind of, it doesn't kind of move culture in the way that it did from the 50s until the sort of early 2000s, I guess.
Yeah, it was an identity when we were young, wasn't it? It was actually your own identity.
Everything. It was absolutely everything. Where now, when you look at people out and about, you couldn't say, oh, that person's into that kind of music, because they could be into all kinds of music. Where we grew up in a time where the identity was everything. So you knew you saw punk, you knew exactly what sort of records they're into. You saw a romantic, you knew what records they're into. And things changed very quickly. So where now people were much more into a lot of things, but it doesn't have that identity that it used to have.
So you also do, well, effectively it's a radio show, don't you, as well, where you're interviewing people. How, for you, it seems like everything you do somehow connects to everything else you do.
It does tend to, yeah. It's not kind of consciously, but it just kind of, everything does kind of feed into each other, really. And but I like that. I think it's quite exciting.
So in terms of exhibitions, what's next for you, Martin?
Well, we've got big show planned for Liverpool, which I can't really say anything about until it's all the funding and everything's in place. And there's a couple of other projects, but everything's kind of, we're just kind of getting. So what happened with the last 18 months? We had Outlaws, Holly Johnson, a show about Lawrence at the Fitzrovia Chapel. I did a show about with Corin Johnson sculptures of Don Letts and Shirley Collins at the Fitzrovia Chapel. Marc Almond exhibition. Everything really came at once because we've been planning for these exhibitions. So the next lot will be next year. So it's just kind of in the planning process because, of course, you need to get funding for these things. And so we had a good relationship with English Heritage. So because these are kind of heritage projects really now, and they are important culturally, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to have lived an era. I mean, I went to Taboo, obviously, uh, knew Leigh. Even had a chat show on MTV with Leigh
Yes,
Bowery.
I've seen the chat show. It's great. Excellent.
Do you know what happened with that? Right at the end, the manager director screamed, "Get those faggots off my channel."
I bet Leigh loved that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know how I survived, but I did. That was it. Actually, I'll tell you an interesting story. The last show, I was told um, that the show is getting very gay. So I decided to invite everyone who was gay on the last show to irritate them. So it ended up with Julian Clary, Leigh Bowery, the Communards, and Nina Hagen, who I thought was a lesbian and
Right.
isn't. So I got that bit wrong. So and me. So that was how the show ended. But I think that era, I mean, for us, obviously, living through an era, it's something that we're incredibly connected to our whole lives. And for other people to actually then experience our experience, I think is a really nice thing to do, because I like experiences, other people's experiences. So I think what you're doing is a really important and valued work. So thank you for that. And
Thank you.
thank you for joining me. And yeah, I hope to see you in London at some point.
That would be great. And I must find those MTV. I must find the episode with the gayest episode on MTV.
Yeah, I don't know where that is. I don't. I haven't got a copy myself, but I remember that
It'll be in
all
the
happening.
archive somewhere or other. Yeah.
Yeah, should be.
I
Anyhow,
think we were
Martin.
lucky. I think we were very lucky to live through through the periods we lived through. Even though it was tough, there was incredible creativity around.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews, and here is where you can connect.